Hello and welcome. This audio recording is designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam and will go over a Part C question which could be found on paper 1. You might find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or you might just want to listen through as part of your revision. That's okay too. Today we'll be looking at the following question. What were the consequences of the Iran-Iraq War? Many of you will be familiar by now with what us history teachers call the PEE technique. That is to say, in each paragraph we will make a point, back it up with evidence in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotations, people, places and events, and then explain it. Phrases such as "this shows" or "this suggests" are helpful in achieving this, and better answers will often give more than one layer of explanation. We call this PE 2.0 because you're doing it twice. So in this response we will use the PEE formula. So, what were the consequences of the Iran-Iraq War? Now, be aware that were this question to turn up, invariably it would be along the lines of the death toll was the greatest consequence of the Iran-Iraq War. How far do you agree? Or economic damage was the greatest impact of the Iran-Iraq War. How far do you agree? Etc. But in the interests of being both thorough and all-encompassing, this question will focus simply on the more generic what were the consequences of the Iran-Iraq War, and will offer a 5-part scope. Okay, let's get started. What were the consequences of the Iran-Iraq War? Point 1. The death toll. Evidence to support this includes: the war had inflicted substantial carnage and devastation on both sides. The death toll for Iran was approximately 1 million out of a total population of 50 million. Iraq, with a much smaller population of 17 million, lost between 250,000 and 500,000 lives. The fatalities on both sides, therefore, represented around 2% of each population. And if the number of people seriously wounded or psychologically damaged had been included, then these figures would have been much higher. And so, in explaining our first point, you may wish to argue that the human impact and the death toll was a significant impact or consequence of the Iran-Iraq War. Point 2. Economic damage. Evidence to support this includes: harm to the economy was also considerable. In just 8 years, Iraq had been transformed from one of the richest countries in the world to effectively a bankrupt state. It owed $80 billion in foreign debt, and annual oil reserves had more than halved to $11 billion. Investments in social projects such as housing, schools and hospitals had to make way for austerity. While Iran incurred a smaller foreign debt, it also faced bankruptcy, and the value of oil revenues had approximately halved to $10 billion. One immediate impact on the people of Iran was that their living standards plummeted. And so, in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that economic factors were also a significant consequence of the Iran-Iraq War. Point 3. It sowed the seeds for the First Gulf War and the invasion of Kuwait. Evidence to support this includes: despite the obvious futility of the war, Iraq's Saddam Hussein claimed that it had been a glorious victory for Iraq. He had halted the spread of the Islamic Revolution and prevented the Ayatollah Khamenei from toppling his regime. And so by surviving, he turned this into a triumph. An imposing monument to this achievement soon appeared in Baghdad, consisting of 2 pairs of giant crossed swords clasped by huge bronze fists. This was known as the Swords of Qudusiyah. Yet Saddam privately recognized that the Iraqi people would not be bought off for long with extravagant symbols such as this, and he needed to find a new way of increasing the wealth of his country, and so he started to consider an invasion of Kuwait. And so in explaining our third point, you may wish to argue that one significant consequence of the Iran-Iraq War was that it sowed the seeds for the First Gulf War. Point 4. Key figures remained. Evidence to support this includes: the website of the Iran Chamber Society, a non-partisan organisation, stated, quote, "At the end, virtually none of the issues which are usually blamed for the war had been resolved. When it was over, the conditions which existed at the beginning of the war remained virtually unchanged. The UN arranged a ceasefire merely to put an end to the fighting, leaving 2 isolated states to pursue an arms race with each other and with the other countries in the region." Unquote. Also, A History of Iraq, published in 2000, stated, quote, "When the ceasefire was accepted by Iran in July 1988, Saddam Hussein trumpeted the victory of Iraq. In terms of his redefinition of the country's war aims, Iraq had indeed been victorious since it had thwarted Iran's attempt to overthrow his regime. It had survived the strains of 8 years of war with its principal figures still in place." Unquote. And so in explaining point 4, key figures still in place, you may wish to argue that one of the consequences of the Iran-Iraq War was that it didn't really have much consequence at all, in the sense that Khamenei and Hussein both remained in charge and neither really achieved their war aims. Point 5. Worsened relations with the outside world. Evidence to support this includes: A History of Iran, published in 2008, stated, quote, "One final bloodletting came in 1988, immediately after Khamenei ended the war by accepting a UN-mediated ceasefire. He announced that he had no choice but to, quote, drink the poison chalice," unquote. In 4 short weeks, special courts were set up in the main prisons, and this witnessed the hanging of more than 2,800 prisoners. Amnesty International described them as, quote, "prisoners of conscience," unquote. And so in explaining our 5th and final point, you may wish to argue that the hanging of prisoners which came about as a result of the ceasefire worsened relations with the outside world, and in particular the UN and Amnesty International. Okay, so we have argued a 5-point scope. In answering the question, what were the consequences of the Iran-Iraq War, we have stated that these have included the death toll, economic damage, that it sowed the seeds for the First Gulf War and the invasion of Kuwait, that key figures remained in place, and finally that it worsened relations with the outside world. Okay, so now it's time for our clever conclusion. There were many varied consequences of this futile war. And with the Iran-Iraq war producing no winner, the nature of the peace reflected the stalemate that had dominated the hostilities during the previous years. As we've said, neither side really achieved their war aims, and both Saddam and Khomeini remained in power. There was no change in the Iran-Iraq border, and the pre-war status quo was restored. Neither was there any long-term diplomatic change, as the Western powers were soon aligned against Saddam in the First Gulf War. And so this essay argues that this was in effect a Pyrrhic victory, a victory for neither side. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye.